Hello, everyone, and welcome to Community Chat, a place where we can just pretty much talk about whatever we want, and you have to listen. So thanks so much for joining us. I'm super excited about our conversation today, and I'm also super excited about the people. We have Sean Langdon, Karen Peter, and John Hamer, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves. Sean is my co-host, so I'm going to let Sean go first. Sean.
Thank you, Carla. I'm Sean Langdon. I live in Vancouver, Washington, and I work for the church here as a youth and camping minister.
Oh, that sounds fun. Karen, what about you?
So I'm Karen Peter. I live just north of Sean in Olympia, Washington, although we never see each other. And I serve as a president of 70, but I work mostly with folks checking out Community of Christ from other faith traditions, especially from the LDS tradition.
Awesome. Thank you, Karen. And last but not least, John.
I'm John Hamer. I live further south than Sean and Karen, although a lot farther east in Toronto, Canada, where I serve as the pastor of the Toronto congregation and our Beyond the Walls kind of global ministry. I'm very excited to be here.
We are excited to have you here, and I'm very excited to have all of you here because the question that we're going to talk about today is something that I don't specifically get asked like in these actual terms, but I feel like people are dancing around this question all the time. And I do want to say that these are opinions that we're giving. This is not any kind of official church statement or policy, but thank goodness. But the question we're going to be answering today is, are we Mormon? Is Community of Christ Mormon? So I kind of just want to say, take it away and go for it. Does anybody want to go first?
So Carla, when you say that you don't get asked this directly, but people dance around it, I'm assuming one of those dances has to do with the long embedded tradition in Community of Christ for those who grew up RLDS of the immediate denial as soon as you tell someone the name of the church that we are not Mormon. That was the extended suffix on the name of the church. And I grew up with that. I grew up knowing that in my heart of hearts, had been taught that at Sunday school all my life, et cetera, et cetera. So is that part of what you're talking about, the dance that's going on?
Definitely that part. But also, me working with seekers here in Utah, I think when people are trying to understand who we are, they really want to kind of dig in and be like, so am I going to understand what's going on in your church, or am I not going to understand it at all? Yeah. So I think that's mostly the dance for me.
Okay. So I'm just gonna dive in. So are we Mormon? Yes. Are we Mormon? No, depending on who you are. So to anybody who's outside of Community of Christ, we look freaking Mormon. We have the Book of Mormon, we have the Doctrine and Covenants, we have a priesthood structure and a vocabulary that matches Mormonism. You hear people talk about Joseph Smith Jr. You hear people talk about Nauvoo. There's an almost idolizing of our historic sites. We are very, very, very Mormon when you look at us from the outside. It's not until you look past those wrappings, if you will, and see the journey that Community of Christ has been on and start to explore the past 50 years and all of the theological and doctrinal changes that have taken place in the church to make us much less Mormon and much more progressive. I don't want to say Protestant because there's more to Protestantism than that, but a more progressive Christian church movement with markers that identify that: Trinitarianism, our Christology, our progressive ideology, all peace and justice, lots of different factors. But the reality is, when I go to Utah, which is equivalent to Mormon, but when I go to Utah, we're Mormon. We're just a different brand of Mormon to most Mormons. And there are days, Carla, here's my opinion coming out. there are days when I've dug into research, or I've listened to John Hamer way too much on podcasts, or I've done other things. I feel so Mormon that it almost makes me ill, because there's such a part of my physiology of growing up RLDS that is, we are not Mormon, that my whole mind, body, spirit just wants to collapse under the weight of Mormonism. So thanks for the opportunity to share that, Carla.
Okay, who's next? Who wants to go next? John.
Yeah, and I was going to give a very similar answer, which is the answer is yes and no, right? It's just to say it depends on perspective. And so I give, for example, lectures most every week in our Center Place lecture series. And they're lots of members of the church, lots of former Mormons, but actually it's mostly just a whole swash of everyone else who was finding us on YouTube and so on. And so from the perspective of anybody outside of the tradition, they're saying, oh, well, I had no idea that there was this kind of progressive Mormons, in other words, because that's a shorthand for them. And they hadn't heard about it before, but it's the only context with someone outside of the broader movement has to understand it. But then, of course, also for people in the in that kind of who are viewing through a thumbnail or a shorthand like that, the major things that they have just maybe planted on there, whatever the thing that they think of Mormons as being about, which is polygamy and maybe the Book of Mormon they're thinking about, but it's like especially what was I trying to think? The getting your own planet kind of thing. So in other words, not believing in the one omnipotent God or whatever. In other words, believing that you can become a God and that kind of thing. Those are I think those are obviously alien to our branch of the tradition, in the sense that we were the people from the beginning who were opposing the introduction of polygamy and related doctrines, including progression doctrine, which is based on polygamy. So in that sense, I mean, in the sense in terms of the term, at this point, nobody's a Mormon almost, because the Mormons, as we think of them in this tradition, have decided that they're, based on their current leader, has decided they're not using that word. And so they've rebranded. There's no longer a Mormon Tabernacle Choir of all things. There's everything has to be rebranded in this very long, tedious name of the church. And so the reality is that right from the very beginning, the movement didn't embrace the term Mormon. And so different people at different times within the movement have decided that they like it. And so, in a kind of a realism moment, the LDS Church in the 70s decided to embrace it in their advertising, from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, which is what all the ads would say at the end. But now they're tired of embracing it, and so they aren't. And so, the same thing is true for us, right? And so at the very beginning, the church was called Church of Christ. But everything's called Church of Christ, so everybody immediately called the group the Mormons, the Mormonites, and so we changed the name to Church of the Latter-day Saints and so forth. And that was a better brand identity in terms of getting people to actually adopt it and use it. But ultimately, we've gone through, a long, the entire identity thing with ultimately the name being the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is this horrible, lengthy name or whatever, until we came back to this name. But from the standpoint of anybody looking at it, though, we're part of the same movement, right? And so even for us ourselves, when we're telling that history that's so valuable to us, we will use as a shorthand talking about our ancestors when the Mormons settled Missouri and so forth, and we mean Community of Christ, and obviously not under that name, but we're talking about our institution, our ancestors, and so forth. And so we may not apply it to ourselves contemporary, in a contemporary setting, although I've heard some people like Bill Russell introduce himself at Sunstone as an old reorganized Mormon, and so forth. But we generally don't use it. But it doesn't mean that we're not Mormons from in the way that outsiders would mean it.
That's so interesting. So for me, culturally in the church, I grew up north of Seattle and here in Washington, and I didn't even really fully understand, I think, the connections between the two until just 10, 15 years ago, and I'm 37 now, and well, almost 37. I shouldn't short myself. I still have another couple weeks. But I never even heard the Book of Mormon preached from or used in a worship setting all my growing up until I was in high school. And it was one person, or one family, I should say, in my home congregation that did. And then I didn't hear it again until till just a few years ago, till many years later. And so I had, there was these things that maybe are markers that I didn't have growing up in the church with that. So other than the name, the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And I certainly went through the whole thing at schools growing up in school where, like Karen mentioned, but we're not, Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but we're not Mormon, name for us. And so it wasn't until, in more recent years that I really fully started to, I fully looked at this connection and how many things are similar and different between where we have grown in different, directions from the beginning. And then now, looking at it from being very involved in ecumenical ministries in Oregon, most of my interactions, they have, they on the outside looking in, without actually looking what's, the iceberg underneath what's on top, what's shown. They have no clue that there would be this connection between to our heritage. And it's not until they either look at our website after hearing about us, or more conversations where I might share more information about that they start to see, they become fascinated at all this history stuff between the two churches, and therefore that name Mormon and Are You Mormon. I always look at, I'm kind of that whole yes, no, but also I don't care category as well, because it's like, for me, it's not relevant to my journey, and yet at the same time, that marker is not relevant to my journey. But I understand it's not a helpful answer if you tell it to somebody who's asking. I kind of view it as this. My last name is Langdon. I'm a Langdon. My grandma's maiden name was Wainwright. I don't call myself a Wainwright. I don't refer to myself as a Wainwright, but it's definitely a part of who I am. It's definitely a part of my heritage, and it definitely shapes me. But it's not my identity right now. My identity is Langdon. And so that's kind of how I view kind of even the word, Mormon within the life of the church. Would I go out saying that I'm a Mormon? No. But is it definitely a part of my identity as Community of Christ? Absolutely.
I appreciate all those answers. That's really interesting. And I'm not sure, Sean, if I cared all that much before either, until maybe I moved to Utah, and is a culture rather than a religion. So like the culture of being Mormon is so strong, at least in Utah, and I imagine there are pockets of it other places in the world, but like not drinking coffee is just so everything, and not drinking caffeine and so on and so forth. And it's the culture here, the wearing dresses and ties to church, so on and so forth. If you don't do that, if you wear short sleeves, like a sleeveless top, then everybody automatically knows something about you. And for me, I do those things with a lot of pride in Utah. I drink coffee, I wear sleeveless shirts, I wear pants to church, all these things that the culture of Mormonism has created, at least here, and is so, so strong here. So in that sense, I'm like, no way, we're not Mormon. When we talk about the culture, I cannot jump into that word. Does anybody else feel like that? Or have you thought about that way maybe?
There's multiple cultures though, so just because, you're reacting to, you're not LDS, of course you're not. But that's how it's expressed, and in terms of this very dominant denomination and branch of the movement in Utah where you are. But if you drove down to Hilldale, there are people who have another very intense way of being Mormon, that with garb and how they're dressed and how they act and so on. that is what they call themselves Mormon. They haven't given up calling it Mormon, fundamentalist Mormons. And so and they have a very, very strong culture as well, but it is different from the culture that you were kind of describing from, Mitt Romney's Mormons and so forth. So I don't know. Community of Christ has a strong culture too, whether or not it's not any one place where it's become an ethnicity so much the way it exists in the Mormon corridor. But it's amazing the kinds of things that I don't know, unite Community of Christ people, and they're very, very similar that you find all across. We have even our own words. The word Zionic doesn't exist outside of the RLDS tradition, and RLDS people are often surprised to not, if you Google that and find out no one else has ever said that, and so on. But anyway, there's just a lot of things. I don't know. There are different kinds of Mormon culture, and we have our own, reorganized Mormon culture.
I think we also have a generational perspective that fits in. So I'm old enough, Carla, to remember when the RLDS Church was very much like what you experienced in Utah. If you grew up in where I did in the Seattle area, I grew up on a communitarian experiment of families who all purchased land together and built houses together and gardened together and kind of shared in all things in common, if you will. And so my entire childhood was immersed in RLDS culture. And when I went to other congregations and other churches, it was the same way. And so you wore dresses and you didn't wear sleeveless and you didn't drink coffee. And God forbid anybody had a coffee pot in the church, and you didn't dance and you didn't play cards. And I mean, that's even not counting the big ones of drinking and smoking and having sex with people you're not married to. Those were like, you didn't even talk about those because people were so concerned about all the minor infractions that were taking place. And so when I'm in Utah and I experience that, it's almost like a deja vu kind of thing, because that was my entire growing up experience in the RLDS church.
It caused me, this conversation, the way that it's shifted, it speaks to to stereotypes, and which obviously, like you mentioned, could be generational and cultural as well. But I definitely, like Carla, lived within the stereotype of like I think coffee was like the main thing that as a young Sean I would use to say the differences between the two churches is that that we drink coffee, we go out to eat and we drink coffee, we have coffee at church, so it is this definitely speaks to I think a stereotype issue as well, that you have to unpack and see what really is underneath there.
I love that. No, we drink coffee at church. Yeah, that's I've heard other people say that was their marker, if you will, that they would offer. Yeah,
it's also
go
ahead.
I was just going to say that's certainly the thing that Jan Ships, who's a historian of the Latter-day Saint movement, but who's not a Mormon, right? So she's a non-member, but who's been a long-time historian. When she studied Utah Mormons all the time, but when she met for the first time at a conference, an RLDS historian, Bob Flanders, and she's sitting down next to him for lunch, and he has coffee, and she stared at the coffee cup just the same as my Mormon grandparents did when I had coffee at a diner with them. In other words, they were way more. My grandparents were way more concerned about the fact that my partner and I were having coffee with them at the diner than the fact that they were with their grandson who was gay and has a gay partner. In other words, that was like less of a, because the coffee, you know what I mean? Coffee. So anyway, same thing. So Bob Flanders says to Jan Ships, because of how concerned she is, that he says, well, you'll notice I let the coffee cool before I drink it. So because he's avoiding hot drinks, right? So anyway.
So is Jan Ships the one who kind of popularized the term Plains Mormons versus Mountain Mormons? Was that Jan Ships or was that somebody else?
Prairie Saints and
Prairie, that was it. Prairie Saints
Prairie
and Mountain Saints.
Yeah.
I wonder which one I am now. Am I a Prairie Saint or am I a Mountain Saint? Because when you say Mountain Saint, do you only mean the LDS Church, or can I be a Mountain Saint now since I live above 5,000 feet?
You're a transplanted prairie saint.
I really am. I'm Midwest through and through. I got to be honest with you. There's no way I'm a mountain person. So it seems like the answer so far is yes and no, which I have to admit is very unsatisfying. Very unsatisfying.
It's very Community of Christ, though.
Darn it! It really is. So any other thoughts about maybe some parts of Mormonism that we haven't thought about too? Anything else we want to say about Are We Mormon?
Well, I was just gonna say that this also causes me to think about like just the generational baggage of a word, like in terms of passing it on, like the fact that, you know, growing up, what was the marker for me was coffee. Well, that doesn't, what does that actually mean, you know, in terms of like, why was there even any baggage attached to that word for my generation then, passing it on from, you know, other generations? It's kind of like when there's constant issues in church where stuff is passed down to other generations that really don't actually have a thing, you know, that maybe it didn't have a direct impact on them. And so like to get to the point of like my generation where it's so superficial that it's just like coffee, you know, like it caused me to think about like that's a whole bigger issue, but within the religious movement. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think about, you know, even unpacking that further, that one word, you know, what it might cause you to reflect on and get to the point where you know, my generation would say, oh, it's just coffee. You know.
Well, I think actually, you know, so Karen said at kind of at the beginning that we have Mormons in our roots, and Sean was like talking about like his maternal family last names and so on. So we don't use the word, but I don't necessarily think that is because we've moved away from what the early experience is meant to be in a sense, because, or was in a sense, because actually what I would talk about when we use the word restoration, let's say, so we can stop like disassociating ourselves so viscerally in our minds from the word Mormon. But anyway, so let's say the restoration. So in the early restoration experience from 1830 to 1844 was not like all lived one way where it was very static. It was a crazy evolution of change. And so when there's a church that, let's say, instead kind of freezes everything, stuck in, you know, 1844 as if that was the fulfillment, you know, the fullness of the restoration, and they try to just live that for another 180 years or whatever, however long it's been, that actually may be abandoning the root of what the restoration experience was. Whereas if you continue on this crazy trek of transformation that has continued on for all of the intervening time, that may actually be what the Mormon experience is, you know. And so in that sense, I think that we might actually be more Mormon than the Mormons, you know, so, or at least, you know, a living restoration is how I kind of call it, as opposed to
which was pretty much the claim of the RLDS Church all along, John. Is that
I know exactly. The Herald was originally called the True Latter-day Saints Herald.
So what you're saying, John, is that we're the most Mormon of them all.
That's what I'm saying.
Oh my gosh, that is mind blowing.
You have your quote.
How's that for satisfying, Carla?
That's pretty big for me to think that we're the most Mormon of them all. I don't even know how I'm going to function for the rest of the day, honestly. But, you know, John, I'd actually heard you say that before, and I remembered you saying that because the early stuff, 1830, 1844, we were moving and evolving and changing, just like you're saying. And we definitely, as a branch of Mormonism, we definitely move and change a lot more than I would guess any other branch does. Right. Certainly not the fundamentalists, certainly not the Brighamites, not the
fundamentalists have changed a lot too, actually. So Warren Jeffs took them on a real crazy detour from where they had been, and so I wouldn't say that nobody's changing. Everybody changes. You know, change happens all the time. But one of the things I think that we fall into a lot, because everybody understands change in their own lifetime experience, and so people look back and they say, "Oh, we've made all these changes in the church from, you know, the 1960s onward or something like that," because we don't have the personal memory of all the changes that were taking place in the 1920s and 30s and so forth. So the church has been, you know, kind of rapidly and wildly changing the entire time. But we're just kind of we have a sense that it was always the one way and then it changed. because we know there were a bunch of crazy things that were still very active in the 60s, like you can't dance and so on. But that doesn't mean that there hadn't been a lot of new nuance added in. Everything about like the entire modern conception of Zion being a social gospel, Zion being building hospitals, Zion being, building these kind of community institutions. Zion in the original times was a farmers cooperative, and so it meant, sharing your tools and harvesting together. But it was under Frederick Madison Smith that it becomes, no, we need to build seniors homes, and we need to help with social housing and so on, the kind and so that kind of thing. So I don't know. I mean, there was change the entire time, even if it wasn't like becoming more inclusive of women leadership or whatever it was, which has happened more recently.
Oh, that's so interesting. It's so interesting. Okay, this has been just fascinating to me. Any last thoughts before we sign off today?
I had one, and that is my son's a few years older than Sean. And when he was in the Air Force in Georgia, he called me one day terrified because he and his girlfriend had watched South Park, an episode with the talking about Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon. And his first comment to me was, "Oh my God, are we Mormon?" And so I realized that the generational perspective Sean's talking about is real. As long as he didn't, and then his second was, do I have to believe all this stuff? So for him, he didn't have to believe a lot of the stuff that I had to believe growing up. And I think it is a lot less of a burden to carry forward.
That was awesome. Thank you so much, Karen, for sharing that. And thank you to Sean and John and Karen for being here and for sharing your knowledge about answering the question, are we Mormon? Thanks so much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Carla.